Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very special episode of Bog Panda. Tonight, we're going to talk about something that I think we've alluded to in the past, but never really done a deep dive on. And that's a classic game that a few of you may have heard of, Doom. I am Dr. Mike at Official Pagan on everything, and joining me, as always,
Hi, everybody. This is Kelly at KELLYTHUL on social media, and welcome to Bog Panda. Sure hope you would consider subscribing, give a few videos likes, comments. We'd like to hear from you. It helps us out algorithm wise. You want to caress that algorithm, which I think is a T-shirt we actually have now. Our new T-shirt shop let us put it up. Yay! So good deal there. Check out that T-shirt store. Now that I mentioned it, some good things that are out there. And when you're done perusing that, be sure and get back to that Bog Panda channel and check out the Hard No playlist, the world's shortest podcast, published daily, uh, every episode less than a minute. What more can you ask for?
absolutely, it's a grower, and we'd love to show you.
I guess you could ask for 2 minutes, but you get one. So less than one.
Well, tonight we're going to talk about Doom. Doom is turning 30, and it's this month that we're recording this. So as you guys know, Kelly and I, both big Doom guys, I feel like I can speak for both of us saying that. Were you surprised at 30 being the number? Because I get the wind knocked out of me sometimes with certain pop culture things when I see, because I feel old. I'm not like one of these people who gets scared by aging, but I do feel older as time passes. I'm aware that I'm growing older, but there are certain things that'll hit me. And Doom being 30, I think, is one of those things.
Yeah, it when those big numbers roll out on anniversaries of things that you said, I didn't think it was that long ago. I used to really enjoy that, and I didn't feel like I was an infant. That was a challenge. So 30 jumped out of you. Not as bad as Billion Dollar Babies being 50 years old. Alice Cooper's greatest album. But
Second.
50, 50 years old. So that's a jarring one too. But yeah, it just seemed like the other day I had a 2400 baud modem kicking up to do a little death match with a buddy till 3 in the morning.
Very nice. So, what was your introduction to this game? Because it was initially released as shareware. So, for any of our younger viewers out there, a lot of times with games, and this was something that id Software particularly was into, they would release shareware versions of the game, which would be sometimes just a demo, but in the case of id Software and things like that, a good chunk of the game to really hook you, so that this cheap disc that you bought and you were free to share it with other people. That's where shareware came from. It was totally legal to lend it to people or make them a copy of it, because the idea was that they would get hooked and want to buy the rest of the game. That's a model that I think is pretty common now, because people are used to games being released episodically or buying a base game and having to add downloadable content to it for additional fees. But back then, it was something that only PC gamers were kind of familiar with. And that plays a big part in the Doom story and where it goes from there. But I know for me, I friend of mine downloaded it. He had a modem that was fast enough. I'm sure it took a day or something like that, but had a modem that was fast enough to download it from the FTP server, was initially put up the shareware. Um, I played it. He's like, you got to come and see this game. I played that shareware version. And then we were out at a store. I want to say it was Comp USA, picking up something for our Gateway PC that we had, and they had the shareware version. And I don't remember, $5 or whatever it cost, because again, it was trying to hook you at the lowest possible price. So I was able to pick that up, and I had my shareware copy. I found the cover image, which I'll provide to Kelly so that we can show you guys here, of the actual shareware release that I had, because there was different releases of it with different covers and things like that. But I found the actual one I had. So were you one of those living in the future people with a fast enough modem to download it, or did you buy a shareware disk or have it given to you, shared with you?
I had it. I got it for free, and I don't know if it was in like a PC magazine. I think it was. I think it was in a gamer magazine or something like that. That's another way they would distribute things quite a while back. Back in the day, too, kids, when things were on floppy drives, you could go buy, and this is true for the Amiga as well. you could go out and buy gamer magazines, and they would often include demos of new software or shareware type of things. And Amiga was big into that as well. And so I think I got the first one probably through a magazine that it was included. And then pretty rapidly fell in love with the game. And I think I was kind of late enough in the life cycle that a lot of the aftermarket Doom stuff had started to make its way out there. The Ultimate Doom, these various things that come packages on a CD with a licensed copy of Doom and levels, user created levels and editor tools and all kinds of fun stuff. And so I'll include some photos of a few of my Doom goodies that I have there. So I got most of the kind of getting to the full bores Doom was through a CD in one of those packages, and then of course the voluminous cheat guides as well for both Doom and Doom 2. I have those, so I'll include shots of all of those for you guys.
Absolutely. And another thing with it too, Doom was a game. I feel like, especially back then, PC gamers and console gamers were usually different people. You didn't see the kind of crossover that you would have now where people would have multiple platforms. Just like even with console gamers, a lot of people didn't have Super Nintendo and Genesis. They had one or the other. So you had people on either side of it. Nowadays, I think it's common for people to game on multiple devices. That just isn't how it was back in the day. So I was mainly a console gamer, but we did have a fairly decent PC for the time and that gateway that we had. So when something good would hit for PC, something I was really interested in, I would be able to play it. Now, Doom was one of those games that was a little bit taxing on PCs for the time. So I do remember playing it at some friends' houses where they had to kind of shrink the screen size down to get it to play. That'll come into play in a minute. And things along those lines. But I remember being able to play it fairly well. I only had the shareware version though for probably about a year or so because you had to at that time mail order the full copy of the game to get a legal copy of it. You couldn't buy the full game at retail. You had to mail order directly from them, which allowed them to keep all the profits from it, shipping it to you directly instead of paying the stores. Um, Before long, though, Doom started to appear on consoles because Doom was getting so big. You had a lot of people who were more console gamers or casual gamers who wanted to check it out. And it started getting so big that at one point Microsoft had financed a study to see what the most installed program on PCs was, assuming it would be Windows, so they could use, some sort of official statistic for that, and found out that it was actually the shareware version of Doom that was the most installed program at that time. So you were getting a lot of people who weren't typically PC gamers, but you were running into issues with that too, because not PC gamers were not familiar with this sort of release strategy of a shareware game and then having to buy extra episodes and things like that to have the complete game. So there was a lot of people, and the creators and the people that did software have talked about this at great length. They would find years later, they would talk to people who, until the console versions came out or until they revisited again later, didn't realize they hadn't played the whole game. They thought the shareware game was the whole game of Doom because they weren't typically PC gamers. So, in a very wise move, Doom did make the jump to consoles. Now, that sounds silly to say because at that time, that was kind of a weird thing for a PC based game to jump to consoles. It was usually the other way around. Now, Doom plays on everything that was ever made. And I think it's only a matter of time before people are born with Doom encoded in their DNA. I think that's right around the corner for us. But at that time, this was kind of a weird, interesting thing when it started to pop up on consoles. So, what was your Doom console experience like at the time?
So, I mean, the vast majority of my time was PC Doom. That there was really very limited console thing because uh, I went Nintendo 64 kind of first, well, Atari 2600, not a good Doom platform. Maybe the only platform Doom can't be put on is the Atari 2600. Atari
Yet. There's
2600,
Halo on Atari 2600, so
yeah, maybe we can then.
I feel like you
Um,
could make Doom.
ish.
somebody do that.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. Be probably very similar to the Halloween game in terms of gameplay.
I would
But
imagine.
the so then Nintendo 64, who had a very serviceable Doom, who I don't really know why Doom 64 never made it into the household, but it didn't. I didn't really get a chance to enjoy that until the emulation days came many days after that. So um, probably a little bit of PlayStation would have been it, which is not a great Doom experience of the console ones. It it it's not great. So
I like PlayStation Doom, but it's really not Doom. It's a weird hybrid of Doom and Doom 2 levels.
yeah,
But what's mostly interesting about it to me is the Aubrey Hodges score for it, which I think is excellent. Also though, the Doom levels are taken from the Atari Jaguar version of the game, which in most of the early console versions of the game, apparently Atari Jaguar was the basis of all console versions of the game
yeah.
for a while. So that was actually made by id Software themselves. So that became the official template if you wanted to make a console version of Doom, with the exception of Super Nintendo, and that worked out super well. But for all of the other console ports of Doom at that time, they were working off of the Atari Jaguar blueprint. So I feel like that would be a good one to start with. I actually didn't play the Atari Jaguar one when it was initially released. That's something that through emulation many years later, I've gotten into, and it's honestly a really excellent port of the game, which shouldn't be surprising because id Software made it themselves. What is your thoughts on that one, sir?
So, I'm kind of going through this. I think we'll kind of settle, although you've gone on record before on kind of your Doom console favorite, but Jaguar's up there for me in terms of it because a couple key things that are important for my full Doom enjoyment is it's very beneficial. We've well established, no sense of direction, super bad for Doom, really, really bad for Doom. So one way to compensate for that is cheat codes. Is to kind of say I'm going to be wandering aimlessly. I'm going to take a lot of damage because I'm going to forget where things are at. So a little invincibility wouldn't be all bad right about now. And one of the nice things on the Jaguar is that was basically a 3-button process to get to unlock some cheat codes, which it's kind of hinky how you'd count it on the PC. It's not 10 buttons, but it's excuse me, 5 buttons, but it's like 5 keystrokes to invoke a cheat code. On the PlayStation 10, so by far the easiest to invoke a cheat code was Jaguar. So that was big. Um, it had a pretty good representation of the levels. Game speed was great. Um, the controller, your weapon selection, it's another one of my many weaknesses is that I get into a panic mode and remembering sometimes the right controller moves to make to kind of quickly switch weapons and some of those things. Sometimes I get a little tangled up on. The Jaguar had the nice overlay that sat on its mammoth controller so that I could just on a 1 button thing very quickly switch from the rocket launcher, which is not a great weapon in tight spaces in Doom, to a more appropriate chainsaw for those really tight sections. So I liked it. I mean, I think the the only thing that I do think I'm probably going to say Jaguar is my favorite version of it. It doesn't have the music though that all the other versions do. Which the full Doom experience is that music. It's definitely you're in the game when you see the graphics, you're in the environment, and that music's playing, and it's just you're in Doom land. It's great. Um, and while it does create the right ambience, it doesn't affect my enjoyment of the game much beyond the fact I know that most of my experiences there's music here. So it's not a fatal flaw for me, but it's not great either that the music's not there.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I remember at the time, and I've seen this repeated on some YouTube videos and things. It was being reported a lot that the music wasn't there because of some sort of rights issue with the composer. That's not the case at all. id Software, when they were making it, Jaguar, as we've talked about on here, had a weird, complicated setup with various processors of different powers. So they decided when they were doing it, in order to get the best frame rate and performance out of it, that they needed to use the processor that would normally be there for audio to just go towards powering the game along with everything else to make sure the frame rate stayed high. And honestly, the frame rate is almost as good as the PC. I mean, you still, because even the PC version, there is slowdown on later levels where it gets crowded and things like that. The game does slow down. It doesn't run perfect. I had to really push the Jaguar version in order to get noticeable slowdown on there, which is really saying something, as you'll see in a minute, or hear us talk about in a minute, is really saying something for a console version of Doom. So I had to put it on nightmare difficulty and get in a few levels in to where there's, a lot of enemies on screen before there was really noticeable slowdown. And it's never game breaking. Even on nightmare difficulty, you're still playing. It's just running a little slower, but everything's still moving. You can still play the game. It doesn't stop or turn into a slideshow or anything like that, 3DO, like some of these things do. So even at its worst, it's still chugging along pretty well. So I can see why people don't like the music. Obviously, I would prefer that it had music in there, and the music is technically in there. It's on the cartridge and in the ROM and everything. It's just turned off during the actual gameplay so that you don't get those frame rate drops and things like that. It's hard to argue because the game does play so well. I do think they probably made the right choice in the long run. It is a shame it doesn't have music though,
It is.
which brings us to 32X, the greatest system of all time. I'll just throw my hot take out there for anybody who's interested. 32X technically had the first console version of Doom on market, but it's really just a demake of the Atari Jaguar version, which I didn't realize at the time because I didn't play the Atari Jaguar version. It's just kind of a demake of that. They literally took the whole game and just, did it on a half the horsepower system, essentially a 32-bit system. And there are some drawbacks to that. The resolution's not quite as clear. It's a little more pixelated in spots, not as bad as what came after it with 3DO and Super Nintendo and things like that, but it is more pixelated in spots. It's also not quite full screen. There's a little bit of a border around there. Again, done in the service of making sure the frame rate stays as high as possible. And while it does slow down a little more than the Jaguar one does, it's still a really solid frame rate. It's a really smooth running game. Uh, it also Sega made the same decision Jaguar did, and they were well aware that Jaguar had done this apparently because this was a part of their marketing. They were well aware that the Jaguar team decided to turn the music off during the levels. They did the same thing, but in an ironically very Jaguar move, they decided to take a shortcut, and instead of having no music during gameplay, they decided to just have the music play through the Genesis. 32X is an upgrade to the Genesis, so it's physically attached to it. So the Genesis is handling the music, but because they wanted to rush it out and get it out before Christmas, they didn't optimize any of it. So they just have a 16-bit system trying to play music that was programmed for a 32-bit system, and it sounds like shit when you go to listen to it, because it's not meant to play that. So Genesis, there are games. So Genesis, the audio is usually the worst quality of any game or the worst category of any Genesis game. And it's because Genesis did not use sample based sounds. So you really had to work to optimize soundtracks when you were doing a port to a Genesis. It can be done. There are Genesis games with excellent music, but it's because they redid the music specifically to work within the parameters of the way Genesis audio worked. They didn't do that at all with Doom. They were like, just make it play that music. And that's what it sounds like. It's not great. It's also missing levels only because they rushed it out to market. Luckily, fans have gone back and corrected this and added the missing content from the Jaguar version back into it. And it still plays on original hardware, which just goes to show they're not doing anything fancy. There's no tricks being done. This absolutely could have worked perfectly. Sega just decided to rush it and not finish the game, which sucks. But otherwise, I think it's a great version of the game. And considering how well it represents, now that I know it's the Jaguar version, how close it is to it, it's the closest of any of the other ports, which are all based on the Jaguar version. This has the most side by side you can compare them to. So if you turn off the music, which you'll want to do, it's almost like playing the Jaguar version. And it is by far the version of Doom I played the most. So it's probably my favorite by default that way. What do you think of the 32X, sir?
So not a ton arguments with you in terms of what you kind of laid out. It is a good gameplay, but if it's almost as good as the Jaguar, then I stick with the Jaguar because it's better.
That's
And
true. I can't argue with that.
so they're that piece. And you can, because you've got a lot more experience, and my notes may be faulty on this, but I do think um both the 32X and Super Nintendo version, which we'll get to, different class entirely, the 32X version. You only have the front of the monsters. Uh,
That
and,
is true. Yeah. It doesn't
and
have the back animation of the
yeah,
monsters. I've seen some people say that that means they won't shoot each other. That's not true. They still will shoot through each other to get to you. You just won't have them stop and turn around and fight each other in the middle of something, but they'll still kill each other to get to you. So you can still just walk in front of other monsters and they'll kill each other to get to you. So it's not quite true. Another thing that I want to dispel a myth of, the BFG is in the game. I've seen tons of things where it says that it's not. It is. The level where you would normally get it is one of the missing levels though. So you have to use a code to get it early. You can get it at any point in the game using a code. So that's unfortunate. But again, that was Sega cutting corners because, like I said, fans have corrected this, and all of this could have fit on the original cartridge. All of it plays on original hardware with these fan patches and things like that. So it sucks that Sega cut those corners because this could have been, it could have really shown what the 32X could have been if it had a longer lifespan.
yeah. And those are to me the other just kind of minor drawbacks on it are that as we've established, no sense of direction. Cheat codes help me out a lot. I also, I'm all about, hey, let's let the monsters take each other out for a while. Let me get them ticked at each other. I'll go wait back here. You guys have it out for a while, and then the herd down. I'll come back in and clean things up. So I don't mind a little. Yeah, you can get the collateral damage as they're coming at you, and they can take each other out. But I like to kind of start something and run away. Let them go for a while. And then, there's nothing sexier than the backside of an imp. So miss that too.
Makes
But
sense.
fair enough.
Well, I think the next one that's worth talking about, we'll stick with 32-bit before we drop down to the 16-bit. 3DO is a special version of Doom. So we've talked about this at great length. The game was made primarily by one person in like a couple days or something, which is terrible. id Software themselves didn't really want it ported to 3DO because they didn't think the system could handle it. So they made the licensing fee for it astronomical, assuming nobody would license it. And somebody did, somebody who didn't know how to program games. They licensed the game, made all kinds of promises that they absolutely couldn't follow up on. The game, to the credit of Rebecca Heineman, the one person who programmed it, she was able to get all of the Jaguar game technically onto 3DO. It just doesn't run well.
No.
You have to shrink the screen down to basically a postage stamp size to get it to look better than a flip book, essentially. And it's rough. The positive things I'll say, the music is great. We did a great review. Our review was excellent as well. We did an excellent review of the great soundtrack for it because 3DO has awesome audio. It's one of the things I've learned delving into that system. And this takes full advantage of that. They re-recorded all of the music. So not only does it have music, it has really good sounding versions of all the songs on there. Also, too, your little Doom guy face in the HUD, when you die in this one, it's one exclusive that it has. His head explodes. So, whereas in all the other versions, the face starts to get bloodied up as we're used to, it explodes in this one. So, there's two positive things I can say about the 3DO version.
Yep. And I have nothing to add on the positive side.
That's-
Because, for this game, lack of smooth gameplay, just, a little slowdown here or there, particularly in a room just chock full of monsters. Totally get that. But the just the post you having to shrink it in a postage stamp size, tough to play. And if you can't be somewhat fluid in the game, it really takes you out of it, in my opinion.
yeah, it's just really tough. And once you start getting into the game, even if you have it on the easiest difficulty setting, once you start getting into the game and there's multiple enemies in a room, it's a flip book that you're watching, which makes it almost impossible to play. So it basically breaks the game. The only reason they even let them release it in this state was because they had announced a 3DO was coming with a much more powerful CD drive. So they thought that it would play better on the more powerful 3DO that was coming out. So essentially, it was like, buy it now and you'll be able to play it when you upgrade your 3DO to the new version. But because 3DO wasn't doing well, that actually never came out. So Doom is just the way that it is on there. Also, too, I don't think it would have made enough of a difference because you can overclock it a little bit when you're playing it on emulation and it'll play better. It's still not great though.
No,
I would take 32X of Jaguar over this overclocked any day.
agree 100%.
And then we have Super Nintendo. Super Nintendo is not based on the Jaguar version, unlike most versions of the game that came out. This is developed by Williams Entertainment, and they decided to go back to the PC game. And this is the only one of these early console versions that returns the sort of episodic feel to it, because what their hope was after seeing the Jaguar game, which has some altered versions of levels and that becoming kind of the standard, and then some either not having music or having terrible music in 32X's case, they were like, we're going to be able to recreate Doom for the PC on Super Nintendo. Now, Super Nintendo is only a 16-bit console, so you're probably thinking, how's that possible? It's not. It's not. The game looks awful. I've made fun of it a lot. It's bizarre to me when people say that they don't like how the 32X game looks, but then don't talk about this when it's like looking at a maybe slightly dirty mirror, but looking at a mirror up to the PC game with 32X. And this is like if you smash the mirror and then stabbed yourself in the eyes and then try to look at it. It is awful. In order to get it to run, so Super Nintendo can't do what Doom is doing. Doom is not actually a 3D game. It's faking 3D. It's a 2D game, but what it's doing is every time you move, it's redrawing the entire screen to match the perspective of where your character would be. That's very intensive on processors back at that time. And Super Nintendo actually had not the greatest processor because Nintendo does that for some reason. They made that same mistake with Nintendo 64, where they gave it very little RAM. So it had a short draw distance. You had to buy expansion packs for certain games, things like that. I don't know why they do that. It's weird, but it's what they do. So it absolutely just could not do that. So what it could do though, the system had what they called mode 7 graphics, which was a built-in kind of scaling and rotation tool that it had. So they faked it, and they had done this once before with a port of Wolfenstein 3D. The thing with Wolfenstein 3D though is it's far less detailed than Doom is. Everything's on one plane. There's no detail. There's no uh, details or pattern on the floor and ceiling whatsoever. There are less enemy types, things like that. And it didn't look great on Super Nintendo doing this much more scaled back game. So how they thought this would work is unimaginable to me. It is interesting. So essentially what it's doing is instead of redrawing every frame, it skips a few frames by just stretching out the image that's in front of you to kind of fake moving. The problem with that is just like it sounds like it would be, it makes it incredibly choppy. The frame rate, things that are more than a few feet away from you are rendered in single digit numbers of pixels, and you get stuck on things a lot
Hmm.
because it's not actually redrawing the screen, it's just stretching it around you. So if you're anywhere near a corner, you're going to get stuck on that corner, which is something that occasionally happens in the PC Jaguar and 32X, but happens if you just look at a wall in this version of the game. So I'm not a fan. What about you, sir?
No, same. The pretty brutal when so I think it's tricky to find secret rooms. To say, oh, that shading's a little different right there. I ought to go back and take a look. Uh, I shouldn't have to have the same level of attention to detail to find ammunition on the ground. And you sent to me one time a photo of or a screen capture of yeah. So there's some ammo down there. I was like, really? I don't think so. So that's no bueno. So so there's not a lot to it was there, but I mean it's not a real good Doom experience in any way, shape, or form. You don't get any fluidity of play. You're talking about there, and then key things that you need to be able to actually see. You got a 50-50 chance that you'll be able to notice them. So
Yeah, because it downgrades everything that's not directly in front of you. When you're looking at items on the ground like ammo and things like that, a lot of times it's just one pixel that's a slightly different shade than the floor itself because there's no details on the floor or ceiling in the way that they rendered it. So it's not good. I mean, it's an interesting thing. Like if this was a fan made thing, it would be pretty cool, but not made by a major developer and put out on at the time one of the biggest consoles.
agreed.
Now, Nintendo did do better years later though with Game Boy Advance. Game Boy Advance, and this is kind of an interesting one because it came, much later, much further down the line. So this is after PlayStation Doom, which still uses for the Doom 1 levels, the Jaguar versions of those levels. It does change the lighting, it changes the music. It actually has a completely different score than the PC version, but it's still using the Jaguar levels. That in turn was then ported to Saturn, which is a whole weird thing in and of itself. So Saturn is the same levels as the PlayStation version of the game, but id Software wouldn't let them make their own engine for it. So the Saturn is essentially a standalone, more powerful 32X. So they made them essentially port it to 32X and then move it to Saturn instead of making their own engine. So it doesn't run great, as that sounds like it wouldn't. But again, both of those games are kind of a hybrid of Doom 1 and 2. So a different thing. Same thing with Doom 64. Doom 64 is a new game.
Yeah.
It's a spin-off game made specifically for Nintendo 64. I never played that at the time. I didn't play that until years later when it was ported to PC and is available on Steam. I think it's only like $5 on Steam. It's an excellent game, though. Another Aubrey Hodges score and just excellent game. But I think I was definitely surprised to see the original Doom make its way to Game Boy Advance. And I'm a big fan of Game Boy Advance and was really impressed with the stuff that it could do. And this Doom port is really interesting because it's still the Jaguar game, but it does bring some of the PC elements back to it. The only thing I don't like about this game, obviously graphically, it's a step down even from 32X and things like that, but it plays pretty well. The one thing I don't like about it though is the game is heavily censored, which is weird because there was plenty of mature rated games for Game Boy Advance. I'm not sure why they did this, but it's the only version of Doom that is teen rated. Uh, the monsters bleed green. There's far less blood. There's none of the bodies on the walls and things like that. And the bodies disappear. Now, the bodies disappearing could also be in service of the game. It makes it run a little bit smoother. But if you're inclined to get lost when playing these games, you can use bodies that stay on the floor as a way to know where you've already been if you're lost somewhere. But if the bodies disappear, you can't do that anymore. So I could see that affecting gameplay. But overall, though, it plays surprisingly well in there and obviously completely destroys the terrible Super Nintendo version. What were your thoughts on it, sir?
Yeah, I actually was pretty impressed with this version. It's a really enjoyable experience to play Doom on the Game Boy Advance. Uh, the and I am assuming while they took some steps to kind of tone down some of the stuff, I have a pretty strong hunch that the bodies disappearing is just less uh, creates less of a tax on the system overall. Doesn't have to keep track of them, doesn't have to continue to render them, and just cleans them off and away you go. Uh, and uh, and I do, as you kind of alluded to, it is helpful for some of us to say, oh, most for me, it's mostly a reminder to say, oh, I'm back in the room I thought I had walked away from because there's all those guys I just killed. I've walked in a circle, and so and I have to figure out something else to do. But and it just throws you the first time it starts to happen as you take out the first couple monsters, and they go pretty quick. They disappear pretty quickly. Um, but once you get past that, pretty enjoyable. I really actually found it to be a really enjoyable version to play.
And speaking of censorship, I a weird thing happens where those first couple console ports, Jaguar 32X, and to a degree the 3DO version of Doom, are actually a little bit gorier than the PC version because you start to get things like body parts on spikes and body splattered on the wall and things like that a lot sooner in the game. Like early levels, you start to see that stuff, whereas that's much later in the PC game. So I think it's actually a little bit gorier in that sense. And of course, with the 3DO version, you get the exploding Doom guy head. So it was weird to kind of go back to this like censored version of it all these years later when, it we're in at that time, we're well into like Grand Theft Auto, things like that at that time when the Game Boy Advance version came out. So it never made sense to me, the censorship. One thing they did do that was really interesting is the early editions of Game Boy Advance were not backlit. So the games were kind of dark and they actually sold Game Boy Advance lights and things like that that you had to attach to it. This game does make the game a lot lighter, the color palette and things like that. So the Jaguar version is darker than the PC game, which I think some people thought was a resolution thing, but it's actually all Jaguar games are kind of dark. Apparently, their color palette, and I'm not a programmer, so I can't explain this in technical terms, but the Jaguar color palette is just darker
Hmm.
for whatever reason. So when you take a game that already is, earth tones and sort of industrial environments, so it's already kind of dark, and you put it with the Jaguar palette, it's a much darker version of the game. So 32X lightened it up a little bit, and this takes that even further to counteract the no backlight versions of Game Boy Advance, which, as a person who was an early adopter of Game Boy Advance, I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean that's probably another reason that I enjoyed the game as much is that it was. I'm a I not that I know where I'm going, but I prefer to at least if I can see a little further, it helps me a little bit too. And I thought it was not that you want like a unicorn bright world for Doom, but I did enjoy the kind of crispness and brightness on the Game Boy Advance version.
Which, if we ever do any sort of a Doom retrospective like this, the Game Boy Advance Doom goes that rainbow bright unicorn color route where everything is super bright in that game. But it works for the game. But again, they're really just doing the same thing and trying to counterbalance that no backlight of the early Game Boy
Yep.
Advance days. But it is appreciated in this game. So it's kind of interesting to see all these ports. And of course, after this, full PC ports started to make it onto later systems and things like that. And now Doom is on everything everywhere. So it was kind of interesting to go back and play all these early ports of the game, especially 30 years later. I replayed through that first episode on the PC game and the equivalent levels on all of these games, if not play through the whole game like I did with Jaguar and 32X. Um, all of them were super fun to play. What were your thoughts kind of revisiting it, knowing 30 years has passed?
Yeah, to me, and you'll see different stuff out on YouTube and stuff when people are like, I don't know why people like this game or not. I love this game. I hadn't really engaged with it a ton. recently. We started talking about it some. I said, well, oh, I want to get back and do that some more. And it's always fun. I find it's a really really entertaining game. We will probably do, I think, probably at some point, the famous Bog Panda game reviews with the Panda ratings. We'll probably need to do Doom on the PC or something like that for a review sometime. It will do very well because in all those categories, I'm a big fan of all that. So I like getting back into it. I've dusted off a bunch of my old Doom stuff, and I'm gonna be interesting to see if any of it can translate to the current era because I've got editors, I've got extra textures, I got tons of stuff that I'd like to kind of get back in because I did a little bit of map building back in the day, and that was always fun too. Just because it was just a game that had a lot of uh, all game the straight plays, awesome. You can do a death match, that's fun. You can do cooperative mode on most of these versions, some of these versions. Um, that stuff's fun, and then of course, then you can make your own level or get some user levels that create some really fun environments and all that. So I'm glad we got back to it and we're talking about it and got and dedicated some time to play it some more.
Absolutely. Same here. And it's really cool to see how Atari Jaguar, which, I think I can speak for both Kelly and I and feel like this is a really underserved system in the retro gaming space. We really need a Jaguar Mini, a really good Jaguar collection to come out on Steam, things like that. It's cool to see how Jaguar, even though that version was probably played far less than everything that came after it and used it, became sort of the basis for all these versions of the
Yeah.
games. And not only that, but when Doom 2 came out afterwards, it dropped the episodes and was just one long campaign, just like Jaguar Doom, which was made by id Software. So they actually, in programming it, because they were a little frustrated with the fact that some people thought they had played the whole game, and then programming the Jaguar version where they decided to take that out to make it more digestible for console gamers, they decided to go that route with Doom 2. So Jaguar even kind of influenced, or their making of the Jaguar version influenced where they went with Doom 2 after this.
Yep. No doubt. Yep. With the exception of the controller, an underrated
Yes.
system.
I would love to see how you make a mini version of that controller.
Yeah, most minis are smaller than that controller.
Yeah, they are.
Bog Panda.